In the summer of 1849, the air over Dallas County, Alabama, hung heavy with the scent of cotton bolls bursting open under a merciless sun, and beneath that sweetness lay the sharper tang of sweat and fear that never quite left the quarters. On the plantation of James M. Brown, a man whose wealth had grown fat on the labor of nearly 200 enslaved souls, the days moved in the same brutal rhythm they always had until they did not. Brown's overseer, William McNeil, a Scots-Irishman with a drink-reddened face and a reputation that reached from Cahaba to Selma, rode the rows each dawn with a cowhide whip coiled at his saddlebow and a short, heavy club of green hickory dangling from his wrist. Men and women who had survived earlier overseers spoke of McNeil in whispers. He did not merely whip. He calculated. He broke bones to teach lessons. He remembered every slight and repaid it tenfold when the master was away in Mobile or Montgomery tending to cotton. Factors and politics dot the people McNeil watched most closely were the drivers, enslaved foremen who stood between him and the field hands, and among them none drew his suspicion more than a tall, broad-shouldered man named Ben. Ben had been born on the Brown place, the son of a woman from the Gullah Coast and a father sold away before Ben could walk. By 40, he carried himself with the quiet authority that comes from knowing every acre of the plantation, every temperament among the hands, every weak board in the stockade fence. McNeil saw that authority as a threat. For months, he had found excuses to lash Ben across the shoulders, to deny him Sunday rations, to threaten sale. In the spring, he had ordered Ben tied to a cotton wagon and given 39 strokes for eyeing him insolent, though every soul present knew the true offense was that Ben had stepped between McNeil and a pregnant woman the overseer meant to strike. By July, the heat pressed down like a hand on the back of the neck, and tempers frayed everywhere. McNeil, half mad with whiskey and the conviction that the people were growing uppity, announced that the daily task would increase by 50 pounds per hand, no matter that the bowls were thinning and the rows already seemed endless. Grumbles rose in the quarters at night, low and dangerous. Old women who remembered the Denmark Vesey talk from Carolina days, and men who had heard whispers of Nat Turner spoke softly of signs and portents, a screech owl that cried 3 nights running, a black snake found coiled in the chapel doorway, blood-red clouds at sunset. Ben listened more than he spoke, but those closest to him, his wife Dicey, his grown son Grandison, a forge hand named Pompey, and a carriage driver called Squire, noticed how his eyes lingered on the smokehouse, where the axes were kept. On the evening of July 21st, McNeil rode back from Cahaba later than usual, drunker than usual, singing a filthy song about a planter's daughter. He found fault with the way the hens had left the cotton baskets and began laying about him with a hickory club. A boy of 15 named Isham took a blow across the temple that dropped him senseless. When Ben moved to carry the boy to the shade, McNeil cursed him and swung again. Something in the air changed then, like the hush before a storm breaks. Ben caught the club on the second swing. For a long moment the two men stood locked, McNeil's red face inches from Ben's, the overseer's breath sour with corn liquor. Then McNeil spat a single word, "nigger," and reached for the pistol at his belt. What happened next would be riddled in terrified fragments by the handful who eventually reached Canada, and in frantic denials by those who stayed behind. Ben wrenched the club free and brought it down once, hard, across McNeil's forearm. Bones snapped loud as a green stick. The pistol clattered into the dust. McNeil screamed high and thin and lunged with the broken arm dangling. Ben struck again, this time to the side of the head. The overseer dropped as though his legs had been cut from under him. Blood ran dark across the packed clay of the barnyard. For a heartbeat no one moved. Then Dicey's voice, steady as Sunday preaching, said, "He ain't getting up no more." Night fell sudden and complete, the way it does in Alabama in midsummer. Lanterns were forbidden in the quarters after 9, but that night small fires burned low behind cabins where ordinarily there was only darkness. Ben stood in the little yard he shared with Dicey and Grandison, the hickory club still in his hand, staring at the blood drying black on the wood. He knew what came next. A white man dead at a black man's hand meant the patrol, the dogs, the ropes, the burning alive. It had happened in Dallas County before, would happen again, but something else stirred to an older knowledge, passed down through generations who had survived the Middle Passage, and the second one across the inland sea of cotton. Flight might save a few. Fight might save a principle. And principle, once blood has been spilled, has a voice louder than fear. By midnight the inner circle had grown to 9. Ben, Grandison, Pompey, Squire, a woman named Beck, who could read a little and kept the plantation birth and death book when the master required it. 2 brothers from the river field called Jim and fed, and a quiet man named Tom, who worked the gin and knew where every key on the place was hidden. They spoke in the low, rapid Igbo-laced English that outsiders could never quite follow. The plan they shaped was not wild rebellion in the style of Nat Turner. They were the few, too far from any town where arms could be seized, but a disciplined withdrawal. They would take what they needed, burn what would betray them, and vanish into the canebrakes and cypress swamps that stretched south toward the Alabama River and, beyond it, the pine barrens where maroon colonies had hidden since the Creek War. If they could reach the Tensaw country or even cross into Florida before the alarm spread, some at least might live free. They set the time for the darkest hour, before dawn, when even the dogs slept heaviest. Each person had a task, Dicey and Beck to gather the children and old ones who could travel light, Pompey to the smokehouse for meat and the corn crib for sacks of meal, Squire to cut the traces on the best mules, Tom to the big house for the keys that would free those locked in the stockade for punishment. Ben himself would go once more to the body of William McNeil, drag it to the cotton gin, and set the torch that would bring every white man for miles riding toward the flames. Away from the quarters and the road south. As the meeting broke up, Ben drew Grandison aside. The boy no longer a boy, 23 and strong as a pine knot, was shaking with rage and terror in equal measure. Ben gripped his son's shoulders and spoke the only words of comfort he could find. "We is starting nothing new, son. We finishing something old." Then he pressed the bloody hickory club into Grandison's hands as though passing a torch. In the east, the first pale streak of false dawn touched the sky, and somewhere a rooster that did not yet know the hour began to crow. The hour between 3 and 4 in the morning is the coldest part of even a July night in Alabama, when the ground itself seems to draw the heat out of a body and the dew falls heavy enough to soak through homespun in minutes. Ben moved first, barefoot so the packed clay would not betray him. The same hickory club now wrapped in a rag and tucked beneath his shirt. He crossed the barnyard where McNeil's body still lay, a darker shape against the dark ground, and felt none of the triumph he had expected, only a vast, hollow certainty that the world had tilted and would never right itself again. He bent, caught the dead man beneath the arms, and dragged him toward the gin house, the heels carving to shallow furrows that would fill with dew before sunrise. The gin stood on a little rise 100 yards from the quarters, its tall brick chimney black against the stars, and inside waited the season's first bales already pressed and waiting for the wagons to mobile. Ben worked quickly. He laid McNeil across the wooden platform where the lint was swept, poured the contents of a small lamp over the corpse and the cotton beneath it, then struck spark to flint with fingers that did not tremble. The flame caught with a soft whoosh, like a sigh, and climbed the dry lint until the whole interior glowed orange. He watched long enough to be sure the fire would not die, then turned away. Behind him the gin began to roar like a living thing. Back in the quarters the others moved in practiced silence. Dicey had already wakened the children with a hand over each small mouth, whispering the old gullah warning, "Duppy walk tonight, Pickney, walk soft." 23 souls in all had been chosen, those strong enough to travel fast, young enough to outrun dogs, old enough to keep quiet. The rest, more than 150, were left sleeping or pretending to sleep. Their instructions simple and terrible. When the alarm came, they were to raise such a wail of grief and terror that no white man would doubt. The killing had been the work of a single desperate man soon to be hunted down. Beck moved among the cabins, pressing a finger to lips, touching foreheads and blessing, leaving behind the tiny bundles of food and the single silver dollar she had hoarded since the master paid her for keeping his books. Pompey and the brothers Jim and Fed came from the smokehouse bed beneath hams, as shoulders of bacon wrapped in croaker sacks. The smell of it drifted across the lane and made even frightened stomachs clench with hunger. At the mule pen, Squire worked with a knife honed on the carriage shop whetstone, slicing harness so the animals could be ridden bareback or led in string. He chose the strongest for mules and the horses that had belonged to McNeil himself, still saddled from the ride home. Tom returned from the big house pale as ash, the iron keys on their ring clinking softly. He had found 2 men and 1 woman locked in the stockade for running. Big Sarah, who had tried to reach her soul child in Selma, Moses, who had struck a patroller, and a young man named Prince, whose back still bore the open sores from McNeil's last whipping. They came out blinking into the faint firelight from the gin, naked except for the rags around their waists, and fell into the column without a word. Prince took one look at the distant flames and began to laugh, a low, broken sound that ended in tears. Ben appeared out of the darkness like a spirit, sun already streaking his face. He did not speak. He simply raised one arm and pointed south. The column-formed children in the center, the strongest men fore and aft, Dicey and Beck walking beside the littlest ones, carrying the smallest on their hips. They moved single file along the fence line where the dewberry vines grew thick and would hide their tracks by morning. Behind them the gin fire crowned, sparks shooting high enough to be seen from Cahaba, and the first shout went up from the white folks' quarters where a house servant had finally noticed the glow. Bells began to ring, dogs to bark, but the sound reached the fugitives muffled, as though the night itself were swallowing it. They crossed the cornfield in a crouch, the sharp leaves slicing forearms already raw from cotton thorns, then dropped into the branch that fed Bogue Chitto Creek. The water was cold and came to the adults' thighs, to the children's waists. Dicey passed the smallest across like bundles of laundry, and no one cried out though the mud sucked at their feet, and leeches fastened instantly to bare legs. On the far side Pompey scattered red pepper from a twist of paper old conjure, to blind the dogs' noses, and they climbed into the canebrake where a man could stand 10 feet away and not be seen. Here the air was thick with the smell of river and rot, alive with the whine of mosquitoes and the distant booming of bullfrogs. Ben halted them only once, when Grandison stumbled and nearly fell. Father and son looked back toward the plantation. The sky above the gin was red as judgment, and now they could see lanterns bobbing as men on horseback fanned out from the big house. The hunt had begun, but it was looking north and east, toward the Selma Road, exactly as Ben had planned. For 2 hours they pushed south through country that grew wilder with every mile. First the planted fields, then Old Creek corn hills overgrown with smilax, then the true swamp where cypress knees rose like the drowned dead, and water moccasins hung from branches thick as a man's wrist. The children were failing now. The smallest rode on hips or shoulders, their heads lolling with exhaustion. Dicey began the old song under her breath, the one the grandmother sang when the ship was still in sight of Guinea. Oh, children, we are going home, and one by one the others took it up, so softly that it seemed the swamp itself was singing. The sound kept them together, kept their feet moving when the mud tried to claim them. Just before dawn they reached the first true refuge, an island of high ground, in the middle of the Bogue Chitto, where runaway Creeks had once camped and where, for 20 years, small parties of escaped slaves had paused on their way deeper into the tensile wilderness. A fallen sweet gum had been hollowed by fire years before, and inside Pompey had cached a rusty fry pan, a small sack of salt, and a flintlock musket wrapped in oilskin treasures left by men who had passed this way before, and never returned to claim them. They drank from the branch, chewed cold hoe cake and fatback, and for the first time allowed themselves to believe they might live another day. Ben stood watch at the edge of the island, staring back the way they had come. The glow on the horizon had faded to a dull red smear, but he could still hear, faint as memory, the baying of dogs turned loose on a scent that led nowhere. Grandison came to sit beside him, the hickory club across his knees like a soldier's rifle. They'll know soon enough it was more than one man, he said. Ben nodded. They always know, he answered. But knowing and catching ain't the same thing. Not yet. Far off, a panther screamed, and the children huddled closer to the fire. Dawn was coming, gray and cautious, and with it the long, brutal light that would search every shadow for their footprints. Ben rose, brushed the mud from his legs, and looked at the 23 faces that had followed him into the wilderness. They were not an army. They were a family choosing death over the slow murder of the rose. And for now, that was enough. The sun rose that first morning like a white-hot coin hammered flat against the sky, and with it came the sound every fugitive dreaded, the deep, rolling note of a plantation horn blown 3 times. Then 3 times again, the signal that riders were gathering. From the high ground of the island, the runaways could not see the brown plantation anymore, only a smear of smoke hanging low where the gin had stood. But they felt the hunt spreading outward in ripples, the way a stone dropped in still water travels until it reaches every shore. Ben listened to the horn fade into the distance and calculated, by now James Brown himself would have ridden in from Mobile or been sent for. The patroller summoned from Cahaba and Selma. Every white man within 20 miles armed and mounted, dogs fed raw meat to make them fierce. The story they would tell one another was already forming. A savage brute named Ben, crazed with rum or conjure, had murdered the overseer in front of women and children and then vanished into the swamps. No one would speak of increased tasks of broken bones, of a woman heavy with child struck across the belly. That part would be forgotten the way a man forgets the weight of the hoe once the sun goes down. They moved again before the heat could thicken, traveling only where water would hide their scent, along fallen logs slick with moss, through pools where herons stood motionless as carved wood, across sandbars that shifted underfoot and left no print. Dicey carried a child named Lil Venus who had gone feverish in the night, the girl's skin burning against her breast while Beck pressed a wad of chewed gypsy leaves to the soles of her feet to draw the heat down. Pompey took the rear, walking backward at times, brushing away broken reeds and scattering handfuls of wild pepper behind him. The country here belonged to no one and everyone. Greek hunters still slipped through it, despite the treaties. Seminole war parties had hidden here as late as 42, and farther south the old Spanish road to Pensacola ran half lost under vines. Maroons had lived in these swamps for generations, some say since the time of the Yamasee War, building chickees on hummocks and fishing with nets woven from palmetto fiber. Ben had heard the stories from an old man named Cudjoe who died the winter before. Stories of hidden fields of cowpeas and rice, of a place called Red House where a man could stand straight and speak his own name without fear. By noon, the column was strung out and faltering. The children could no longer be carried. They walked now, stumbling, their lips cracked from the salt meat. Big Sarah, whose back still wept blood from the stocked whip, began to lag, and when Prince tried to take her arm she shook him off with a pride that cost her the last of her strength. They made camp no fire this time on a ridge of pine where the ground was dry enough to lie down. Ben posted Grandison and Squire on opposite ends with the old musket and McNeil's pistol, though only 3 loads of powder remained between them. The rest collapsed where they stood, drawing what comfort they could from the thin shade. Dicey opened her bundle and passed around the last of the cold hoe cake. They ate it dry, licking the crumbs from their palms like animals. It was Tom, the quiet gin hand, who first heard the dogs. He had been lying with his ear to the ground the way the old hunters taught, and he came scrambling back through the pines with eyes wide. Close, he whispered. Maybe 2 mile. Coming up the creek same way we did. Ben did not ask how many. The sound itself would tell soon enough. He gathered them in a circle, speaking low and steady. They had one chance, and only one. The dogs would follow the strongest scent, and the strongest scent was blood and sweat and 23 bodies moving together. They would split. 5 would stay with him and lay a false trail straight south toward the Alabama River, where the steamboats ran and every white man would expect them to head. The rest Dicey, Beck, the children. The wounded would go with Pompey and Squire east into the deepest Keene, then cut north again toward the marshes of the lower Cahaba, where the water was black and bottomless, and no dog could follow. They would meet, if they met at all, at the Red House. 3 days' walk if a body knew the hidden ridges. No one argued. They had known from the first footstep outside the quarters that not all would see freedom. Dicey kissed Ben once, hard, on the mouth, tasting salt and smoke. Then she turned away before either of them could weaken. Grandison started to protest he was a man now. He would stay and fight, but Ben laid a hand on his chest and pushed him gently toward his mother. You keep them alive, he said. That's your war now. The boy's eyes filled, but he nodded. Within minutes the larger group had vanished into the green wall of cane, moving later without the slow and the small, though every step tore at them. Ben watched until the last flicker of Dicey's red head rag disappeared, then turned to the 5 who remained. Pompey had refused to leave him, Tom, Prince, Big Sarah, who could no longer walk far, but swore she would die before she was taken again, and young Isham, the boy McNeil had clubbed the day before, whose temple was swollen purple, but whose eyes burned clear. They waited until the baying was close enough to distinguish individual voices. 6, maybe 8 dogs then broke cover running. Ben carried Sarah across his shoulders like a sack of meal. The others fanned wide, crashing through brush and splashing across every slough they met so the scent would scatter. They ran until the blood pounded in their ears and their lungs burned with the taste of pine needles. Ran until Sarah's weight threatened to drag Ben to his knees. Then they climbed a tall persimmon tree whose trunk forked low and hid themselves among the leaves. Below, the dogs came on in a tangle of brindle and black, tongues lolling, followed by 4 white men on lathered horses and 2 patrollers on foot with long rifles. One of the riders was James Brown himself, face the color of uncooked meat, shouting McNeil's name as though the dead man might yet rise and point the way. The pack milled beneath the tree. Frantic, until one old redbone caught the scent that led south and gave voice. The riders cursed and spurred after him, crashing away through the vines. When the last hoofbeat faded, Ben let Sarah slide gently to the ground. She was unconscious, her back crusted black with old blood and bright with new. Prince tore a strip from his own shirt and bound the worst of the wounds. But they all knew she would not walk again that day or any day. Night was coming, thick and starless, and somewhere behind them the hunt still rode. Ben looked at the faces of the 5 who had chosen to buy the others time, and for the first time since the hickory club came down on McNeil's skull, he felt something like peace. They had not asked for this war, but they would fight it now with whatever was left, teeth, nails. The weight of a dying woman's body used to slow the dogs. Somewhere far off an owl called, the sound lonely and free, and Ben closed his eyes and listened as though it were calling his true name. Night sailed over the swamp like a quilt soaked in coal oil heavy, suffocating and ready to burn at the touch of a spark. Ben and the 5 who stayed with him moved only when the moon slipped behind a cloud, carrying Big Sarah on a litter fashioned from hickory saplings and the same vines that tore at their legs. Sarah drifted in and out of fever, murmuring the name of the child taken from her in Selma, sometimes calling out for water in a voice so small it barely stirred the mosquitoes that feasted on them all. Prince walked at her head, pressing a folded leaf of sassafras to her lips whenever she woke, and every time she swallowed the bitterness he whispered, "We still walking, and you still walking with us." They followed no trail now, only the low places where the water stood black and shining, where a man could step from cypress knee to cypress knee and leave no print for even the sharpest hound. The air smelled of rot and night-blooming jasmine, and every breath tasted of death and stubborn life mixed. They had one purpose left, to draw the hunt as far south as legs and cunning could carry them. Before the end came, every mile they gained was a mile the women and children to the east did not have to run. Ben measured distance now not in acres, but in heartbeats, in the number of times Sarah's breath rattled before she slipped back into silence. They crossed the old Spanish trail at a place where the sand had blown across it years ago, and nothing grew but wiregrass sharp enough to cut skin. Pompey knelt and felt the ground with his palms, the way his father had taught him on the Guinea coast before the slavers came, and he swore no horse had passed in a week. That meant the main body of riders had turned west toward the river or east toward Cahaba, still believing the fugitives meant to reach a steamboat or lose themselves in the piney woods. For the first time in 30 hours, Ben allowed himself a thin smile that had nothing to do with joy. Near midnight, they found a hummock no bigger than a cabin floor rising out of the marsh, crowned with a single lightning-scarred oak. Here they laid Sarah down and built the smallest possible fire, no more than a handful of fat wood shavings cupped in Tom's broad hands. The flame lived only long enough to boil a tin cup of water gathered from a bromeliad high in the oak, water clean enough to wash Sarah's back and give her a swallow laced with the last of the laudanum Prince had stolen from the big house medicine chest months before, when his own whipping sores would not let him sleep. Sarah opened her eyes once, clear for the first time since the stockade, and looked straight at Ben. "Tell Dicey I ain't sorry," she said, the words scraping out like gravel. "Tell her I walked far enough." Then the fever took her again, and she turned her face to the bark as though listening for the child who was not their dot while the others rested. Isham the boy climbed the oak with the agility of the squirrel he once hunted for the pot, and from the topmost branches he could see far across the moonlit waste of water and reeds. He came down shaking with excitement. Lights 3, maybe 4 moving slow along the western edge of the swamp. Lanterns on flatboats pulling where horses could not go. Patrollers had borrowed boats from the river plantations. They were quartering the sloughs now, dragging chains to raise bodies if the runaways had tried to swim. Ben listened to the boy's report without surprise. White men always found a way when the quarry was black. He roused the others and they lifted Sarah again, gentler this time, as though she were already ancestors. They left the fire dead and the ground scuffed so the trackers would know someone had rested there, then moved on into water that came chest high and stank of alligator. Dawn found them in a part of the swamp no overseer's map had ever marked, a maze of narrow ridges and sudden drops where the water turned from black to the color of strong tea. Here the cypress grew so thick their branches locked overhead, and the light came down green and sick. They were down to 9 rounds of powder, the musket, McNeil's pistol, and 2 knives. Pompey carried Sarah now. Her weight had grown less with every hour. Somewhere behind them, a gun fired one sharp report that echoed until the birds rose screaming from the trees. Ben halted the column and made each person drink from the leather flask. Tom had filled back at the hummock. The water tasted of earth and hope gone sour. But it was all they had. It was Prince who saw the chickie first, a low platform of cypress logs raised on stilts above the flood, half hidden under curtains of Spanish moss. No smoke rose from it, no canoe lay beneath, but the roof of palmetto thatch looked new, maroons. Ben felt the hairs rise on his arms the way they had the night McNeil died. They approached slow, hands empty, and opened the way runaway etiquette demanded. When they were 20 paces off, a man stepped from the shadows of the moss stall, thin, skin the color of burnt copper, wearing nothing but a breech clout and a necklace of alligator teeth. He carried a Spanish musket older than he was, and his eyes held the flat calm of a man who had already died once and found it not so bad. The man studied them a long time, letting the silence stretch until even the mosquitoes seemed to wait. Then he spoke in a gullah so pure it brought tears to Pompey's eyes. "Who killed the buckra?" he asked. Ben stepped forward and opened his shirt to show the blood dried stiff across his chest. McNeil's blood, 3 days old now and black as tar. The maroon looked at it, then at Sarah dying on the litter, then at the children's faces peering from behind the men. He nodded once, the smallest motion, and turned his back, a signal of trust older than any white man's law. Inside the chickie waited a woman and an old man with a face like carved ebony, and on the fire a pot of turtle and wild rice that smelled of heaven itself. They ate squatting on the platform, while the maroon, his name was July, listened to the story, poured out in 3 languages at once. When Ben reached the part about splitting the group, July's woman, a small fierce person called Queen, made a sound like an angry cat. "You leave picnic with no fighting, man," she scolded, but her hands never stopped spooning food into the children. Sarah woke long enough to eat a mouthful of rice before slipping into the sleep that has no dreams. July studied the sky through the moss and told them the flatboats would reach this far by dusk tomorrow if the wind stayed west. He had powder, lead, a canoe hidden under sawgrass, and a debt older than any of them, the people who still carried the memory of chains. By the time the sun stood overhead, a bargain had been struck without words. July and his people would take Sarah and the weakest 3, Tom, Isham, and Prince, who refused to leave Sarah, deeper into the swamp to a place the creeks called Atagi, the hidden town, where a handful of red sticks and twice as many maroons had lived unmolested since Jackson's time. Ben, Pompey, and young Isham Isham was gone with July. Ben corrected himself. Ben and Pompey alone would turn west again, back toward the hunt, back toward the lights on the water. They would make themselves the loudest noise the swamp had ever heard, so that no boat would police for days. Pompey accepted it the way a man accepts that the sun will rise. They embraced July like brothers. Queen pressed a small gourd of gunpowder into Ben's hand, and then the 2 men stepped off the platform into the tea-colored water and began to walk west. Without looking back out behind them, Sarah breathed once, deep, like a swimmer coming up for air, and did not breathe again. Queen closed the woman's eyes with fingers gentle as a mother's and began a low keen that would carry Sarah's spirit across the water to the ancestors. Ahead of Ben and Pompey, the sun burned white through the moss, and somewhere not far off a dog bayed once, sharp and certain, as though it had caught the scent of the only thing left in the world that mattered. The heat of the 4th day rose out of the ground like steam off a boiling pot, and the swamp itself seemed to breathe fever. Ben and Pompey walked west with the deliberate clumsiness of men who wanted to be followed. They broke reeds high enough to be seen from a flatboat, let their feet drag so the mud showed plain, once even left Pompey's head rag snagged on a yaupon bush where the red would flare. Like a signal flag, they no longer spoke. Words had been burned out of them somewhere between Sarah's last breath and the moment they turned their backs on the chickie. Only the rhythm of their steps remained, and the knowledge that every print they pressed into the soft earth bought another hour, another mile, for the ones moving. Silent to the east out by mid-morning, they reached the edge of the great raft place the old people called the Trembling Lands, where the river had changed course so many times that the ground itself floated on a mat of roots and peat. Here a man could step on what looked like solid earth and sink to his waist in black water. That stank of centuries of leaves. Cypress trunks rose out of it like the pillars of a ruined cathedral, draped with moss so thick it hung to the water in gray curtains. Ben had heard McNeil boast he would never chase a runaway into the raft. The overseer claimed the place was full of haints and quicksand that swallowed horses whole. Now Ben blessed McNeil's cowardice, for it meant the white men would come slow, poling their boats along the edges and shouting to one another instead of riding straight through. They waded in up to their chests, using the butt of the old musket to feel for solid footing, moving from root to root the way children cross a creek on stepping stones. Leeches fastened to their legs in black strings. Pompey paused once to burn them off with a coal from the small fire steel he carried in his mouth. The hiss and smell of scorched flesh making Ben's stomach turn, though he had seen worse. When they reached a small island no bigger than a wagon bed, Pompey climbed a cypress and lashed the red head rag to a limb 20 feet up. From half a mile away it would look like a man waving surrender or a challenge. Then they sat back to back in the shallow water, loaded the musket and the pistol with the last of July's powder, and waited for the sound of oars. It came sooner than they expected. 3 flatboats nosed out of the green shadows, each poled by 2 white men and carrying to moor with rifles across their knees. James Brown stood in the bow of the foremost boat, hateless, his thin hair plastered to his skull with sweat, face so contorted with rage it looked bruised. Ben recognized the others, a deputy from Cahaba named Perkins, who had once shot a runaway off a mule. At 50 yards, to patrollers from the Bogue Chitto beat, and God's own Joke McNeil's younger brother Malcolm, come up from Mobile with blood in his eye and a new wig coiled at his belt. They saw the red rag at the same moment and gave a shout that scattered herons from the trees. Like buckshot, Ben waited until the first boat was 30 yards off and the men were standing to aim. Then he rose dripping from the water, musket at his shoulder, and fired straight into the mass of them. The old Spanish lock flashed bright in the sun. The ball struck the gunwale and splintered it, showering the men with splinters sharp as needles. Malcolm McNeil screamed and clapped a hand to his cheek where blood poured bright. Before the smoke cleared, Pompey had the pistol up and fired. The second boat's pole man dropped his pole and sat down hard, clutching his thigh. The swamp exploded into noise curses, the splash of oars, the flat crack of rifles answering to late. Ben and Pompey were already moving, sliding off the island into water that closed over their heads and came up spitting mud. They swam beneath the surface the way the Maroons had taught generations of runaways, breathing through hollow reeds when they had to, letting the current carry them north around a bend where the cypress grew so thick. The boats could not follow. Behind them the white men thrashed and shouted. One boat grounded hard on a hidden log, another spinning lazy as the pole man bled into the water and drew the first alligator. With a swirl like a log coming alive, James Brown's voice rose high and thin, promising dollars and land to the man who brought him Ben's head, promising torments out of hell for any who failed. The words drifted across the water and lost themselves among the trees. Ben and Pompey came ashore a mile downstream on their bellies like otters, crawled into a stand of sawgrass sharp enough to slice cloth, and lay listening while their hearts slowed. The hunt was broken for the moment. The white men would have to drag their wounded back to solid ground, send for more boats, more dogs, more men, hours, maybe a full day. Enough, if the ancestors were kind, for Dicey and the children to reach the Cahaba marshes where the water ran to deep, and a black for anything with 4 legs to follow. They did not rest long. Pompey tore a strip from the tail of his shirt and bound a gash across Ben's forearm. He had not even felt open. Then they rose and started east again, not running now, but walking with the loose-jointed gait of men who have spent everything, and found there was still a little left. The sun moved across the sky and began its slow fall toward the pines. Mosquitoes rose in clouds thick enough to choke a horse. Somewhere far off thunder muttered, though no rain came. They crossed a ridge of hard ground where turkey buzzards sat in a dead sweet gum like black fruit, and Ben knew without asking that they feasted on something the hunt had left behind. Maybe one of the dogs, maybe something that had once answered to a name. Night came sudden, the way it always does when a man is too tired to mark the hours. They found a hummock with a single chinquappa and oak and climbed into its branches. To keep off the ground, Pompey took the first watch, sitting astride a limb with McNeil's empty pistol across his knees like a child's stick gun. Ben slept without meaning to. Dreamed of Dicey walking through fire carrying little Venus on her hip. Dreamed of Sarah standing whole and straight in a field of ripe cotton that stretched clear to Africa. He woke to Pompey's hand on his shoulder and the knowledge that the time for running was nearly done. Below them lights moved again, fewer now, cautious, keeping to the open sloughs. Fewer dogs too. The swamp had taken its tithe. James Brown's voice no longer carried. Either the man was hoarse or he had learned that noise draws more than men. Ben looked at Pompey in the faint starlight and saw his own exhaustion mirrored there. The same knowledge that the circle was closing. They had bought for days in which children who had never known a gentle touch might taste free air a little longer. For days for Grandison to grow into the man who would tell this story when all of them were bones, Pompey reached into his shirt and drew out the small twist of red flannel Queen had pressed into his hand back at the chickie. Inside lay a single root, black and knobby. For the end, Queen had said in Gullah to deep for Ben to follow. Pompey held it out now. Ben shook his head once, not in refusal, but in recognition. They had both seen men bite the root when the ropes were ready, seen the body jerk once and lie still, while the soul walked free. Ben took the root anyway, tucked it behind his own ear like a preacher's flower, and smiled for the first time since the gin burned. They climbed down from the oak and started walking again, toward the lights this time instead of away. The hounds heard them first and set up a clamor that rolled across the water like Judgment Day. Lanterns flared. A voice Perkins the deputy shouted that he had them now. Ben and Pompey walked on, shoulder to shoulder, empty-handed, barefoot, stripped of everything but the will that had carried them this far. The swamp opened before them into a wide bayou silvered by starlight, and on the far side the lights gathered thick as yellow jackets around carrion. Ben began to sing under his breath, the old rowing song the women used when the boats came back from the fields. Before I'd be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave and go home to my lord and be free. Pompey took up the bass line, his voice cracking but steady. The sound drifted across the water, and for one astonished moment the shouting stopped, as though the white men had never heard anything like it in their lives. Then the rifles began to speak, orange flowers blooming in the dark, and Ben and Pompey walked into the bayou until the water closed over their heads, and the song went with them. Down deep where no chain could ever follow, the bodies of Ben and Pompey never came up. The bayou kept them the way it had kept Creek warriors and Spanish deserters and countless others, who believed the water owed them a final mercy. By the time the sun rose high enough to burn the mist off the trembling lands, the hunt had turned sullen and quarrelsome. Malcolm McNeil, one cheek laid open to the bone by the splintered gunwale, cursed his brother's corpse for dying in such inconvenient country. James Brown stood in the bow of the lead boat staring at the place where the singing had vanished, and for the first time since word reached him in Mobile, he felt something colder than rage, something that tasted of doubt. The dogs refused to enter the water again. Even the fiercest hound whined and backed away with lead to the edge. As though the bayou itself had taken a side, they dragged the swamp for 3 more days, poling every channel, grappling with chains until the iron was fouled with roots and turtle shells. On the second day, they found Pompey's shirt caught on a cypress knee, torn half away and dark with blood that might have been his or an alligator's. On the third, they pulled up the hickory club, the same one that had crushed William McNeil's skull, now swollen with water and slick with green moss. Brown took it in his hands and stood silent so long that Perkins finally asked what he meant to do with it. Brown said nothing. He only tied the club to his saddle when they rode out of the swamp at last, as though it were a trophy and a warning both. Back on the plantation, the story had already hardened into the shape white Dallas County needed. A savage named Ben, helped by a handful of Confederates, had murdered the overseer in a drunken frenzy and then fled. The rest of the quarters were innocent, terrified, loyal souls who had hidden under their beds while the madman set the gin ablaze. Rewards were posted from Cahaba to Montgomery, $500 for Ben alive, 300 dead, half again as much for any of the others named in the notices. The newspapers called it the Brown Plantation outbreak, and within a week the New Orleans Picayune was retailing it as proof that leniency bred rebellion. No one mentioned the extra 50 pounds of cotton, the broken bones, the pregnant woman struck across the belly. Those details belonged to the people who had to go on living there. The quarters themselves were quiet in a way that chilled even the house servants. Where once there had been singing at dusk, now there was only the sound of pallets being turned and children hushed to quickly. Dicey's cabin stood empty, the doorway covered with a piece of sacking that fluttered whenever the wind came up from the river. Grandison's forge was cold. The bellows hung slack, the anvil already beginning to rust in the summer rains. Old people sat on their doorsteps and spoke softly of duppies walking abroad, a fire seen in the swamp that had no wood to feed them. When James Brown rode through the lane on his way to settle with the insurance man about the gin, mothers pulled their children inside and would not let them out again until the hoofbeats faded. 10 days after the escape, a strange procession came down the Selma Road for wagons loaded with new enslaved people, bought cheap at the Montgomery Forks to replace the ones lost to absconding or death. Brown had acted fast. Empty cabins invited questions, and questions invited inspectors from Mobile who might notice that the task weights were still set at McNeil's murderous level. The new people were mostly from the border states, tall Ebo men who spoke little English, women with infants born on the march south, a few light-skinned house servants meant to fill the places of those who had cooked and watched for generations. They were marched into the quarters at dusk while the old residents watched from doorways. At windows, faces closed as shutters. That night the whispering began in earnest. A woman named Scylla, who had once belonged to the McNeil family in South Carolina and remembered William as a boy, told the newcomers what everyone already knew, that Ben and Pompey were not dead, not truly. They had gone into the water singing, and water carries a song farther than any bird can fly. Others spoke of lights moving in the swamp, green like corpse candles, of dogs found with their throats torn out, though no panther had been seen in Dallas County. In 20 years, the story grew with every telling until even the patrollers riding night watch began to hurry past the turn-off to Bogchitto, touching the irons at their belts for comfort. Far to the east, beyond where any white man's map reached, Dicey's smaller band moved through country that belonged only to memory and rumor. They had reached the Blackwater marshes of the lower Cahaba, where the river spread wide, and shallow over beds of white sand, where herons stood like gray ghosts, and the only sound was the wind in the wiregrass. Grandison carried little Venus now. The child's fever had broken on the third night after the parting, as she rode pickaback with her arms tied around his neck, whispering stories she made up about birds that could carry people across the sea. Beck walked with the birth and death book still hidden. Beneath her skirt she had not let it go even when they crossed. Water to their chins, and every evening she opened it by firelight and added new names in careful script. Sarah, gone to the ancestors. Ben and Pompey, gone to water. The rest still walking. They found the Red House on the 14th night, guided there by a chain of signals older than the state itself, a pattern of broken reeds, a piece of red flannel tied to a persimmon tree, the faint smell of wood smoke drifting north on a wind no white man would notice. The settlement lay on a ridge above the river, hidden so deep in live oaks and magnolias that a stranger could walk within 20 yards and see only green. Chickees stood on stilts above the flood line, their walls woven tight from palmetto, and small fields of cowpeas and rice climbed the sloping terraces the creeks had built. Before the removal, maybe 40 souls lived there, maroons who had escaped from Georgia and Florida, a handful of red stick warriors who had never surrendered, to Seminole families who had slipped away during the last war. They greeted the newcomers with the quiet courtesy of people who had long ago stopped expecting anything from the world except more trouble. Dicey stepped forward and opened her bundle. Inside lay the one thing she had carried all the way from the brown plantation, McNeil's silver watch, torn from his waistcoat as the gin burned. She laid it on the ground between her feet and crushed it beneath her heel, until the crystal shattered and the works spilled out like bright insects. Only then did she speak. "We come with empty hands," she said in the Gullibo mixture the Red House people understood, "but we bring full hearts." The elder, a woman named Mom Chloe, who claimed to have been born on a ship off Goree Island, nodded once and touched Dicey's forehead with a thumb stained red from pokeberries. The children were led away to be fed, the wounded examined by a root woman who smelled of camphor and gunpowder. That night the drums began low, steady, speaking a language no overseer had ever learned, and the people of the Red House danced for the ones who had not come and for the ones who had. Back in Dallas County the summer ripened into fall, and the cotton opened white as gilt. New overseers came and went. None lasted long. One hanged himself from the same rafter where the whipping post was bolted. Another rode into Cahaba one morning and never returned, leaving his horse tied to the rack in front of the tavern with the reins still knotted. James Brown grew thin and drank before noon, waking sometimes in the night shouting that he heard singing under the house. The Hickory Club disappeared from his saddle one morning, though no one saw it go. Children found it months later, half buried in the lane, the blood long since washed away by rain, but the wood still dark, as though it remembered. Dark, as though it remembered. Years later, when the war came and blue-coated soldiers marched through Alabama asking questions no white man had ever thought to ask, an old woman named Beck sat on the gallery of a schoolhouse in Marion and told the story to a captain who wrote it down in a ledger that eventually found its way north. She told it plain, without flourish, how 23 had walked out of bondage on a July night in 1849, how some had reached free soil and some had fed the swamp, how the song had never stopped traveling. The captain asked what happened to the child Lil Venus. Beck smiled for the first time in the telling. "She grown now," she said. "Teach school in Canada." still sing the same song her daddy taught her on Grandison's back. Only now the children sing it in English and French both, and somewhere. On certain nights, when the wind comes out of the south carrying the smell of river and night-blooming jasmine, people along the Cahaba swear they hear it still low, steady, coming from no direction in every direction. Before I be a slave, I be buried in my grave. The song moves through the trees like green fire, looking for anyone still brave enough to follow. The years after 1849 did not erase the story. They buried it the way river silk covers a blade dropped in anger, until only the edge shows when the light is right. In Dallas County, the brown plantation changed hands twice before the war. Sold cheap because the quarters were unlucky and the gin lot refused to grow anything but devil's shoestring. Cotton kept blooming white across the same fields, picked by new hens who never learned the old names. The lane where Ben once stood with the hickory club in his fist became just another red dirt track between rows, and children born after emancipation ran it barefoot without knowing whose blood had first soaked it. But memory is longer than ownership papers. In the low country churches of South Carolina, in the brush arbor meetings along the Alabama River, in the quiet kitchens of freedmen's cabins in Cincinnati and Chatham and Halifax, the story lived and grew. It was never written in the newspapers again after the first lurid notices faded, yet it traveled farther than any broadsheet ever could. Old women who had once belonged to the McNeil family carried it north when they followed the soldiers in '64 and '65. Young men who heard it around cook fires in the colored troops carried it west to Kansas and Colorado. By the time Reconstruction collapsed and white men began writing new laws to chain the children of the freed, Ben's name had become a quiet prayer spoken in dozens of accents. Remember the Alabama overseer. Remember what one man started with a piece of hickory and a heart that would not bow. In the great swamp itself, the Red House settlement endured longer than anyone expected. Children were born there who never saw a white face until they were grown. They learned to read from a single tattered Bible and from the birth and death book Beck kept, until her eyes failed. When federal troops finally came up the Cahaba in 1865 looking for Confederate stores that were never there, they found the Ridge Village by accident and stood astonished while Mom Chloe offered them water from a gourd dipper and asked, in English careful as Sunday clothes, whether the Jubilee had truly come. The soldiers wrote letters home about the lost tribe they had discovered, and for a few months newspapers in Chicago and Boston carried sketches of straight-backed black Indians who lived free in the wilderness. Then the reporters went away, the army marched on, and the ridge settled back into the silence it had kept since the Spanish left. Grandison lived to see the soldiers. He stood on the ridge with little Venus, now a tall woman called Miss Venus Brown, who taught 30 children under a brush arbor, and watched the blue columns wind along the river road. He was 40 by then, hair already gray at the temples, hands scarred from the forge he had built for the settlement. When a lieutenant asked his name, he answered without hesitation, Grandison Ben, sir. My father killed a tyrant in 1849 and bought this ground with his blood. The lieutenant wrote it down, uncertain whether the man was hero or felon. But the name stayed in the regimental records and surfaced again in 1887, when a congressional committee investigated the old patrol laws of Alabama. By then Grandison was dead, buried under a live oak with the hickory club laid across his chest the way a knight is buried. With his sword, Dicey lived longest of all the originals. She crossed into Canada in 1871 with Venus and Venus's 3 children, walking the last miles on feet that had never quite healed from the leeches and the sawgrass. In Buxton, she married a quiet blacksmith who had escaped from Maryland, and together they raised a family that filled a whole church pew every Sunday. She never spoke much about the night the gin burned, but when grandchildren asked why she sometimes woke shouting in the dark, she would pull them close and say only, your granddaddy Ben is walking the floor again, making sure we all still free. She died in the winter of 1894, peaceful, they said, with a smile on her face like she heard singing nobody else could catch. Years later, in the 1930s, a young man from the Federal Writers Project found an old woman in Selma who claimed to have seen the fire when she was a child. She was 90 if she was a day, toothless, eyes milky with cataracts. But when the interviewer mentioned the name Ben, she sat up straight and began to sing in a voice thin as November wind. Before I be a slave, I be buried in my grave, and go home to my Lord and be free, sang it through twice, then told the young man quiet, almost shy, that on certain nights when the cotton was opening and the moon hung low over Bogue Chitto, folks still saw a tall man walking the water with a club across his shoulder. checking that the rows were empty and the doors of the cabin stood open to the night. "He ain't never left," she said. "Some debt's too old to settle with dying." The interviewer wrote it down exactly as she told it, but his supervisor crossed out the last paragraph before the report went to Washington. "Ghosts," he said, "were not part of the project." Yet the pages survived in a mislabeled folder. And in 1971, a graduate student at Tuscaloosa found them while researching resistance narratives. She followed the trail north to Buxton, found Venus Brown's granddaughter still teaching school, still singing the same song to children who thought it was just an old spiritual. When the student asked where the song came from, the woman smiled and said, "From my great-granddaddy Ben, who killed an overseer in Dallas County in 1849 and started something that ain't finished yet." Today, the swamp has changed. Dams upstream turned the Blackwater sloughs into shallow lakes, and cypress logging took most of the big trees before the conservationists came. The Red House Ridge is part of a wildlife refuge now, marked on maps only by a number. But on summer nights, when the heat lightning flickers over the water and the air smells of river and resurrection fern, park rangers sometimes find offerings left at the edge of the boardwalk, small bundles of red flannel. A piece of hickory wood worn smooth, once even the silver watch face crushed flat and laid on a cypress knee like a coin for the ferryman. No one is ever there when they look. Only the wind moves in the reeds, carrying a low sound that might be thunder far off, or might be voices walking the water the way they have walked it for more than 170 years steady, unhurried, making sure the path stays open for anyone still brave enough to follow.